At the Wildlife Haven Sanctuary, no one could believe what they were witnessing. Shadow, the elusive gray wolf who had been skittish and withdrawn for the past 3 months, sat still in the corner of his enclosure. His piercing green eyes, usually clouded with fear, were now alert, fixed on a stranger standing just beyond the chain-link fence. The man wore a navy and red flannel shirt and worn khakis. Shadow's ears twitched, his gaze unwavering, as if the world had narrowed to just this moment. Slowly, the wolf rose, his lean, powerful frame taut with focus, but devoid of hostility. Step by careful step, he approached the fence, never breaking eye contact. James Carter stood motionless, his pulse racing. He had crossed continents, driven by a fragile hope that Shadow was still alive and that their unique bond endured. "Do you know me, old friend?" James murmured, his voice thick with emotion. As the distance between them shrank, a spark of recognition flickered in Shadow's eyes. To understand this moment, we must go back to where it all began. In the amber glow of a late afternoon, a lone figure glided through the tall grasses of the Willow Creek Reserve in Montana. Shadow, a majestic gray wolf, moved with regal grace, his silver gray fur catching the fading light. His keen eyes tracked every rustle in the underbrush. At 7 years old, Shadow was a striking adult male, raised in this vast reserve since he was a gangly pup. The researchers had named him for his elusive nature, watching him grow into a skilled hunter. Among them, James Carter, a 57-year-old biologist with weathered features and graying hair, felt a special connection to Shadow. Their bond began 5 years earlier when James found Shadow entangled in a poacher's snare, his leg bloodied and his body trembling. Instead of lashing out, Shadow locked eyes with James, as if measuring his intent. With steady hands and quiet words, James freed the wolf, treated his wounds, and released him back into the wild. From that day, an extraordinary relationship took root. Shadow remained wild, but he would sometimes appear when James was in the reserve, watching from a distance with quiet curiosity. On rare occasions, he allowed James closer than any other human, a silent nod to the trust between them. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, James's colleague, with a decade of wolf research under her belt, was astonished by their connection. "I've never seen a wild wolf behave like this with a human," she'd say, watching as James spoke to Shadow in a low, calm voice about the mountains, his childhood in Oregon, or the daughter he rarely saw since dedicating his life to conservation. Shadow would sit, ears perked, as if absorbing every word. But tragedy struck one autumn day. While James was away at a conference, poachers breached the reserve. Armed with tranquilizers and ruthless precision, they targeted Shadow for his pristine silver coat. A dart, a cage, and Shadow's world was ripped away. When James returned to find Shadow gone, grief consumed him. Shadow wasn't just a research subject. He was a symbol of everything James fought for. He launched a global search, rallying conservation groups, but weeks turned into months with no trace. On quiet nights, James would sit on a rocky outcrop overlooking the valley, whispering his vow to find Shadow, no matter the cost. Shadow awoke in a cramped, dark space, his senses assaulted by the stench of metal and human sweat. The tranquilizer's fog lingered, but his instincts screamed danger. Iron bars caged him, stripping away his freedom. For the first time, the King of Willow Creek was a prisoner. His journey was a blur of terror, sealed trucks, a rumbling aircraft hold, more cages. Food and water came sporadically, just enough to keep him alive, but not strong. His once powerful frame weakened, and the fire in his eyes dulled. After weeks of travel, Shadow arrived at a grim facility in a cold, industrial corner of Eastern Asia. The air was thick with smoke and the clank of machinery. This was an illegal wildlife trading hub, where creatures like Shadow were commodities. His spirit, though battered, refused to break entirely. He watched his captors, waiting for any chance to reclaim his freedom. Back at the Wildlife Haven Sanctuary, where Shadow had been taken after an international sting operation shut down the trading hub, his recovery was slow. Fear had replaced his confidence, and he shunned human contact until James appeared. The sanctuary staff had contacted James after recognizing Shadow's unique markings from the global alert he'd issued. When James arrived, he stood by the enclosure, heart in his throat, hoping against hope. As Shadow approached the fence, the air seemed to still. The wolf's nose twitched, catching James's familiar scent. A low whine escaped Shadow's throat, and he pressed closer to the fence, eyes locked on James. The sanctuary staff watched, awestruck, as the wolf, who had shunned all others, seemed to remember. This one man. For James, it was a miracle, a testament to a bond that neither time nor distance could erase. In the days that followed, James visited daily, speaking softly to Shadow, rebuilding trust. The wolf's strength returned, his eyes regaining their wild spark. Though Shadow would never return to Willow Creek, his health required sanctuary care. Their reunion proved that some connections defy species, borders, and even the cruelty of fate. At the Evergreen Sanctuary in rural Oregon, the air was heavy with the scent of pine and damp earth. Shadow, the gray wolf, who had been a ghostly presence in his enclosure for months, paced restlessly. His once lush silver coat was dulled, his frame gaunt from his ordeal. The enclosure was larger than the iron cage of his captivity, with soft soil and scattered trees, but it was still a prison. Harsh floodlights replaced the gentle glow of moonlight, and around him other animals, mournful Amur tigers, listless mountain lions, and rare creatures from distant lands, shared his fate, their spirits dimmed by confinement. In the early days, Shadow fought back. He snarled, clawed at the bars, and tested every corner for escape. But the unyielding steel and concrete wore him down. His resistance faded, not into defeat, but into a quiet vigilance, waiting for a chance, however faint. Visitors came daily, gawking, speaking in strange tongues, snapping photos with blinding flashes. Shadow retreated to the shadows, curling into the darkest corner to avoid their stares. But at night, when the facility quieted, he would gaze through a small, barred window at the stars. In those moments, he remembered the sweeping valleys of Willow Creek, the rush of wind through his fur, the scent of pine after a storm. In fleeting dreams, he saw a man with a steady voice and kind hazel eyes, a man who carried no threat, only a warmth Shadow couldn't name, but felt deeply. Meanwhile, in Montana, James Carter refused to abandon his search. He chased every lead, whispers of poaching rings, reports of illegal wildlife shipments, working tirelessly with local rangers and global conservation networks. His colleague, Dr. Sarah Mitchell, watched him waste away, consumed by his mission. He barely slept, his meals forgotten, driven by a promise to the wolf who had trusted him. To others it seemed an obsession, but to James it was a debt he could not ignore. Hope flickered when an international task force uncovered a wildlife trafficking network in Southeast Asia. A raid was planned on the grim facility where Shadow was held. On the night of the operation, chaos erupted. Sirens wailed, lights flashed, and shouts filled the air. Shadow crouched in his cage, ears pinned, unsure if this was danger or salvation. Hours later, new faces appeared, people who moved with care, their voices soft. A woman approached, her scent unfamiliar, but her demeanor calm. Shadow didn't understand her words, but her gentle tone eased his fear. Days later, Shadow was transported to Evergreen Sanctuary. The environment was kinder, more space, natural light, and caregivers who tried to heal his battered body and spirit. But the trauma lingered. He shunned food, avoided humans, and hid among the enclosure's rocks, his green eyes wary. The sanctuary staff, led by animal behaviorist Dr. Emily Larson, worked patiently, noting Shadow's unique markings from the trafficking records. They kept his name, unaware it was the one James had given him years ago. Word of the rescue reached James through a conservation newsletter. A grainy photo showed a wolf, with a familiar silver-gray coat and distinctive black-tipped ears. His heart raced. It was Shadow, thinner and scarred but alive. James made the journey from Montana to Oregon, navigating bureaucratic hurdles to gain access. Skeptics in the conservation community doubted a wild wolf could remember a human after months of torment. But James knew their bond was deeper than science could measure. On a crisp autumn morning, golden leaves drifting across the sanctuary grounds, James arrived. Dr. Larson led him to Shadow's enclosure, explaining his fragile state. "He's been through hell," she said. "He may not react the way you hope." James nodded, his throat tight, and stepped toward the observation area. The enclosure mimicked a forest, with pines and boulders, but Shadow was nowhere in sight. Dr. Larson pointed to a rocky outcrop where he often hid, then left James alone, knowing Shadow responded better to a single presence. James stood still, eyes scanning the enclosure. Minutes passed before a faint rustle caught his attention. Shadow emerged, his movements cautious, eyes locked on James. "Hey, old friend," James whispered, his voice trembling. Shadow froze, ears twitching, nostrils flaring as he caught James's scent. Something shifted, a spark in the air, a memory stirring. The wolf took a tentative step forward, then another, his gaze never wavering. "Do you know me?" James asked softly, as Shadow neared the fence. His tense posture softened. His tail flicked, and a low, almost inaudible whine escaped his throat. Dr. Larson, watching via a distant monitor, gasped. Shadow wasn't just calm. He was responding to James in a way no one else had witnessed. The wolf pressed closer to the fence, his green eyes bright with recognition. In the weeks that followed, James visited daily. Shadow's appetite returned, his movements grew bolder, and he began to explore his enclosure with a hint of his old confidence. Though he would never roam Willow Creek again, his health required sanctuary care. The bond with James rekindled his spirit. Dr. Larson marveled at the transformation, calling it a testament to trust that transcended species. For James, it was a promise kept, proof that even in a world of cruelty, some connections could endure. At Evergreen Sanctuary, Dr. Emily Larson watched in awe as Shadow, the gray wolf, transformed. His rapid recovery, sparked by James Carter's presence, was unlike anything she'd seen in a traumatized animal. She began documenting every step, her notes forming the basis for research on wolves' psychological resilience and the profound bond between humans and wild creatures. James and the sanctuary team turned their focus to the next step, returning Shadow to Montana's Willow Creek Reserve. It wasn't an easy choice, but they agreed it was what Shadow deserved, a chance to reclaim his wild home. 6 months after their reunion, a cargo plane touched down near Willow Creek. Inside, Shadow shifted in a reinforced transport crate, James at his side, speaking softly to keep him calm. The reserve had prepared a transitional enclosure to help Shadow readjust. When the crate opened, Shadow stepped out, nose twitching as he inhaled the crisp Montana air. James stood nearby, tears in his eyes. "Welcome home," he whispered. Shadow paused, meeting James's gaze with a look that seemed to bridge their worlds. With a slow turn, he loped toward the open valley, not a farewell, but a promise of their enduring connection. 5 years later, Shadow thrived in Willow Creek's vast forests and rolling hills. The wild had healed his physical scars, though memories of captivity lingered in his cautious movements. At dusk, he often perched on a rocky ridge, his silver-gray coat glowing under the fading sun. His green eyes, once dulled by fear, now radiated the quiet authority of a wolf reclaimed. The sense of pine, earth, and distant elk filled his lungs, grounding him in the freedom of his true home. Shadow hunted with patience, a skill honed by his ordeal. The reserve's elk herds grazed unaware as he watched, waiting for the right moment. But something had changed in him. Researchers noted that while most wolves shunned humans, Shadow seemed to discern intent. He vanished from tourist sight, melting into the forest, but with familiar researchers, those who'd known him before his capture. He occasionally lingered, watching from a safe distance, a silent acknowledgement. With James, the bond was deeper. After Shadow's return, James stayed in Montana. "I can't leave," he told Dr. Sarah Mitchell. "Not when he's out there." He respected Shadow's need to be wild, but often visited the reserve's quieter corners, where he knew Shadow roamed. James never approached too closely, content to sit, sometimes sketching or writing, letting the wilderness surround him. On rare occasions, Shadow appeared, resting on a distant ridge, watching the man who had saved him. One spring evening, as James sat by a gurgling creek, a rustle made him turn. Shadow stood just 10 meters away, closer than ever in the wild. Beside him was a sleek female wolf, her gray coat flecked with black, her eyes wary but curious. James froze, heart pounding. Shadow had brought his mate, an extraordinary gesture. "She's stunning," James whispered. "You've done well." Shadow's ears flicked, and for a moment, the three stood in quiet harmony, human, wolf, and mate, defying the divide between their worlds. Then, with a slight dip of his head, Shadow led his mate into the trees, vanishing as silently as they'd come. The female, named Luna by the reserve staff after the moonlit nights James had described to Shadow, became a familiar sight. A year later, trail cameras captured their pups, lively, silver-furred bundles tumbling under their parents' watchful eyes. The reserve flourished, bolstered by global attention from James's papers on his bond with Shadow. New conservation strategies emerged, inspired by their story, protecting more land and wolves. 10 years after the rescue, James, now in his late 60s, embarked on his final expedition before retirement. His hair was snow-white, his steps slower, but his passion for the wild burned bright. On a quiet evening, he sat on his favorite ridge, the Montana sky ablaze with gold and crimson. As darkness crept in, a familiar shape emerged. Shadow, now an elder wolf, moved with measured grace, his coat faded but his green, eyes still sharp. Behind him trailed young adult wolves, his grown pups, the next guardians of Willow Creek. Shadow approached closer than ever, stopping mere meters from James. Their eyes met, two old souls bound by a decade of trust. No words passed, but in Shadow's gaze, James saw recognition, respect, and something like gratitude. In James's quiet tears, Shadow perhaps saw the same. As the last light faded, Shadow turned, his pack following, melting into the forest. It was their final meeting, but their story had come full circle. James and Shadow had shown that respect and compassion could forge a bridge across species, reshaping how humans viewed the wild. Somewhere in Montana's vast wilderness, Shadow's descendants still roam, perhaps carrying a faint, instinctive memory of the man who saved their ancestor, ensuring their future under the boundless sky.